Welcome to a Scotland Then episode. In this episode, I will tell you about some of the stories in the newspapers back in February 1966, all of which came from the Scotsman on the 25th and 28th of February and the Daily Record on the 26th of February 1966. The first article that caught my eye came from the Scotsman on the 28th of February, but it wasn't the title of the article that I was drawn to, but the picture of a wee 2-year-old boy on a train gazing up into the eyes of an elderly guard on the last train from Aberdeen to Ballater, with the wee boy, Neil, being the youngest passenger on this train. The Deeside Railway opened in October 1853, initially only travelling from Aberdeen to Banchory, with 3 services a day. Upon the railway opening in October 1853, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who had bought Balmoral Castle in 1848, which is situated about 8 miles west of Ballater, also travelled on this train, although the special Queen's carriage terminated just outside of Aberdeen at Ferry Hill, instead of the main railway station in Aberdeen. In 1855, this service was extended to 5 services a day, and then the line itself was extended to Aboyne in 1859, which is about 18 miles east of Balmoral Castle, so the railway was getting closer to the castle. Then in October 1866, the line was extended to Ballater, which became the Royal Station, completing the line and being about 43¼ miles or 69.6 kilometres long, and the passenger trains taking between 1 hour 50 minutes or 2.5 hours to complete the journey. However, despite the royal carriage, which was used by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert once a year until his death, then by Queen Victoria twice a year, going direct from Ballater to Ferry Hill, which was about 42.5 miles and 68.4 kilometres, as the Queen did not like speed, it took about 1 hour and 15 minutes to travel this distance. Queen Victoria used the Deeside Railway from its opening until 1900, just a few months before she died. A special daily messenger train also ran on this line when the royal family were at Balmoral, with the last messenger train running in 1938. However, back to the article in February 1966, and the last ever train from Aberdeen to Ballater, with Queen Elizabeth II having used the last royal train in October 1965, a few months earlier. Apparently there were fantastic scenes at Ballater when the last train ended its Deeside Railway journey, including many railway enthusiasts who travelled there for the occasion, with one veteran railway worker commenting, "If half of those here had used the line when it was still running, it would not be closing tonight." However, it seemed a few hours before there was still some debate about the closure of the Deeside Railway, with a meeting being held in Aboyne where a petition of 200 signatures against the closure of Deeside Railway was presented, with a local MP being criticised for having done very little and deciding to handle communication with Parliament on his own and not working with a local railway preservation committee. Although there was a report from a local transport committee that was divided on whether the closure of the Deeside Railway would cause any hardship and had recommended that an additional 10 buses would be needed. But since that report, the 2 bus operators in the area had merged and services had actually been reduced from 13 buses being available to only 6. If you were living along the Deeside Railway line in 1966, did the closure have an impact on you? According to deesiderailway.co.uk, the reason for the Deeside Railway closure even being considered was due to the 1963 so-called Beeching Report, which recommended this amongst many other branch lines for closure. According to Wikipedia, Deeside Railway passenger services were withdrawn completely on the 28th of February 1966, and a 5-arch viaduct that carried the original services was demolished in June 1989. However, a very small, 1-mile portion of the original route still exists today as the Royal Deeside Railway, which Royal Deeside Railway Preservation Society plan to extend further in the future. The next story came from the Scotsman on the 25th of February, with the article being titled, "Term in Homicide Case Halved Due to Unique Circumstances." The victim was the wife of Thomas Morris, although for whatever reason this article doesn't actually mention Thomas's wife's name. Apparently Thomas, 42 years old, and his unnamed wife had been happily married for about 20 years and had two sons who were 16 and 12 years old. This apparent, perfectly harmonious marriage came to an abrupt end on the 29th of August 1965 when Thomas's wife died, following extraordinary special circumstances, which were thus. Thomas and his wife went to a party on the 28th of August, and during the party the couple had an argument, ending with Thomas slapping his wife across the face, with it being debated in court whether he had slapped her in order to bring her to her senses when she had apparently become hysterical, or whether this slap had been given in anger. Whatever happened, the pair went home and the quarrel continued, with Thomas being seen, although it didn't say by who, pulling his wife from the bedroom by her neck into the hall, causing her to fall back and strike her head on a cupboard door. This injury led to the death of Thomas's wife that same day. While Thomas had been found guilty at his trial of culpable homicide, being sentenced on the 10th of January to 6 months, he appealed this sentence, with his counsel stating that there was insufficient evidence to justify this conviction, and that until this incident there had been no suggestion that Thomas and his wife had anything other than a harmonious marriage, and that the jury had not been entitled to convict for culpable homicide, as it had not been established beyond a reasonable doubt whether Thomas's wife had been pushed by her husband or whether she was in fact trying to escape from her husband's grasp. Thomas's counsel went on to say that Thomas had no previous convictions, had his own successful business, and was regarded by everyone who knew him to be anything but an aggressive person, and for the trial judges to consider that this has been a tragic accident for which no further penalty is required than the knowledge that he, Thomas, directly or indirectly, was the cause of his wife's death, and that he had suffered enough. The appeal judge's decision was that while the conviction must be upheld, due to the fairly unique circumstances leading to Thomas's wife's death, they had made the decision to reduce his 6-month sentence to 3 months instead. Do you feel that this was the right decision? Was Thomas's wife's death punishment enough, or should he have been held more accountable? The next headline that stood out to me, due to it being in black, bold letters across the top of page 7 in the Daily Record on the 26th of February, and reading, "Families flee from petrol bomb." This potential disaster took place at Calderwood service station in East Kilbride, when a tanker loaded with 4,000 gallons of fuel burst into flames, while the driver, Joseph Boyle, was working on top of the tanker. Imagine the shock of the service station boss, Mr. Nisbet, that night when he left the service station and everything was fine, only to return 5 minutes later and be faced with utter chaos. Following the tanker being driven into the service station on the Friday night, the driver parked up, jumped down, and began to climb a ladder to get on top of the tanker, as, according to a post from RM Web, the unloading was done by inserting a pipe through an opening on the top of the tanker. It was reported that the fire brigade and police officers were on the scene almost immediately, and while 2 police officers helped Joseph Boyle down from the tanker and to safety, firemen sprayed the tanker and the flames licking around the outside of it with 1,000 gallons of foam, all the while being sure there was bound to be a further gigantic explosion from the remaining sections of the tanker. A father of 2, George Stoddart, who lived only a few yards from the petrol station, later said, "I heard a loud whoosh and looked out the back door to see flames shooting from the tanker." Realising just how dangerous this was, George grabbed his 2 children, 8-year-old David and 6-year-old Christine, and fled from their home to safety. As other police officers arrived on the scene, a full-scale evacuation of families from nearby houses began. Thankfully, though, on this occasion, there were no further explosions from the tanker, with a police officer saying, "If the tanker had gone up, and goodness knows why it didn't, the explosion would have been fantastic," and a fire officer saying that an investigation would be undertaken to try and find out how the fire started. The tanker driver, Joseph Boyle, did receive significant facial burns and was taken to hospital, although was said to have been satisfactory the following evening. Did you live in the area or know someone who did when this explosion happened? The service station boss said in the article that, "I saw petrol tankers go up during the war, so thank God this one didn't explode." So clearly this accident could have been so much worse. The next two stories came from the Scotsman on Friday the 25th of February and appeared side by side. But whilst one was very forward-thinking, the other seemed to be wanting to keep a foot in the past. The heading over the two articles read, "Cut Price Computer for the Highlands," which would seem initially quite dry, but as you'll hear, it's anything but, as it involves the Invergordon Distillery. Who would have thought that the small town of Invergordon and its distillery in the Highlands would be home to the first ever commercial computer to be used in the Highlands? This might potentially not have been to every distillery worker's taste, as upon the installation of the computer, the 23-year-old warehouse manager, Matthew Aird, said that it means that we know exactly how many casks there are, what kind of casks there are, their content right down to the last drop of whisky, and precisely where they are in the warehouses. The computer did, however, open up the possibility for further research to be carried out at the distillery, as well as new ventures, such as hiring out the computer at reduced rates to other local firms. And the computer would also be useful to local authorities, as there was due to be a change in the law later in the year, which would make rates payable in instalments. Any future developments, though, would land on the shoulders of Ian Gregg, who was the only computer programmer in the Highlands, as well as being the captain and centre half of the Ross County football team. And speaking of the Ross County football team, there was another first at the time, which was that Sheena Thompson had been elected to the board of Ross County Football Club, making her Britain's one and only woman director of a football club at the time, according to the Scotsman. Sheena was also the wife of Invergordon Distillery's managing director, dealing with the financial side of things for the football club as well as raising funds. Despite these two firsts in Invergordon, however, it was surprising to read what Sheena said about women playing football, which was, "I've never played myself, and I don't think that women should," which she apparently said very firmly. And finally, a wee glimpse into what would have been your Saturday TV entertainment back on Saturday the 26th of February 1966. Well, the first things I noticed was that not only did TV viewing not start until noon, but when it did start, there were only two channels to choose from, BBC and STV. Can you imagine that nowadays? So it looked like most of Saturday afternoon TV on both channels until about 5:15 p.m. were sports programmes such as boxing, golf, ice skating, athletics, wrestling and ice hockey, to mention a few, with the first non-sport programmes starting at 5:15, The Flintstones on STV and Doctor Who on BBC. These programmes were then followed by the news. Before, on the BBC, you would have been entertained with Jukebox Jury, which was a music panel show which ran from 1959 to 1967, Dixon of Dock Green, which I've heard of but haven't seen, I suppose it's an early version of The Bill, Bertram Mills' Circus, The Black and White Minstrel Show, which was a British light entertainment show which ran for 20 years on the BBC, and Bewitched, which I have heard of Bewitched and I've watched it. Then there was the news at 9:20 p.m. On STV, there'd be Thank Your Lucky Stars, which I'd not heard of, but apparently it was a British television pop music show which aired between 1961 and 1966, kind of like Top of the Pops, I guess. Followed by the early evening film at 6:35 called Where No Vultures Fly, starring Anthony Steele, Dinah Sheridan and Harold Warrender, which was followed by Morecambe and Wise, Peyton Place and Scott Sport, before the news at 9:55 p.m. For the remainder of the night on BBC until 10:50 p.m. when TV viewing closed, there was the World Figure Skating Championships, the Dick Van Dyke Show, with Dick still being about today at the ripe old age of 99, having just had a birthday, and Sports Reel. While on STV, the news would be followed at 10:50 p.m. with a programme called Mystery and Imagination, which again I hadn't heard of. And according to Wikipedia, it was an anthology series of classic horror and supernatural dramas, broadcast between 1966 to 1970. The STV entertainment concluded after The Untouchables at 11:40 p.m. So there you have it. That would have been your Saturday TV. Have you heard of any of the shows that I hadn't? Maybe you even watched them and it's brought back memories for you. And did they keep you entertained? So that's just some newspaper stories from February 1966, but there were so many more stories that I just couldn't tell you. If you're interested in finding out more about what happened in the past, the website I use for research is the British Newspaper Archive. I pay a subscription because I use it quite a lot, but there are over 4 million free-to-view pages, covering not just Britain and Ireland, but the Caribbean, India and more. If finding out more about the past interests you too, then I have an affiliate link for you, which you can find in the show notes or at scottishmurders.com. I hope you enjoyed this week's Scotland Then from 1966. A new Scottish Murders episode, the last of 2024, will be released next week, which will be an unresolved murder case in Glasgow from 1985, with the murder weapon being a machete. So until next time, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.